All right, and that should be visible to everybody. Thumbs up on that. Democratizing goods. All right, awesome. And governance through participatory budgeting, deliberative assemblies, and participatory action research. Apologies for the long title. I got reprimanded on that on Telegram. I had a perfectly good title, but for some reason I gave another one. So I just, even before I get into who I am, just want to start off with a couple quotes. And the first is, if you would like to give us feedback about rebuilding New York City and making it more resilient to future storms and climate change, please email us. And this is posted on the newyorkcity.gov website 10 years ago. So if you're a New Yorker or you were in New York at that time, you may know that this is the 10th year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. And Superstorm Sandy was a massive storm that hit New York that killed 43 New Yorkers and knocked out power where I was, and knocked out power for 2 weeks, knocked out power to the city for several days. And this is one of the contexts in which I've experienced and learned a lot about participatory governance and its failures. I'm a professor. I'm also a founder of a nonprofit. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And I've worked with New York City government pretty extensively for the last 10 years. And I can tell you, as someone who's being asked to do a report and to give a lot of talks on what's happened in the last 10 years and are we ready for the next storm, we're not in New York City. And so that's one context in which I'm looking at participatory governance. The next is a little bit context of this effort relative to some of the milieu that a lot of you are in, and let's just put it on the table, right? So there's also the notion of the startup, and I know a lot of folks in this conference are part of that milieu, and this is a startup as an anti-democratic myth-drenched monarchy. And this is a quote from a New York Times article that just came out a couple weeks ago, sorry. And I think it's self-explanatory. So let me just read a little bit here. And this is like the longest quote I have of the day. So what's distinctive about Curtis Yarvin, who's this kind of tech philosopher guy, is his hostility to democracy as such, which Blake Masters, who's a tech person who's running for Senate in Arizona, and Peter Thiel seem to share. As James Pogue reported in Vanity Fair, Mr. Masters has taken to citing Mr. Yarvin on the campaign trail. He has repeatedly referred to his own campaign, like Mr. Trump's presidency, as a startup. And according to Thiel, the Thiel-like doctrine, startups are not democratic. As Mr. Masters records in the notes from one of Mr. Thiel's lectures, a startup is basically structured as a monarchy. We don't call it that, of course, because anything that's not democracy makes people uncomfortable. And that's something we're going to come back to. Founders should not run an absolute dictatorship, Mr. Thiel said, according to Mr. Masters' notes, but they do need to be more tyrant than mob to give their companies the nimbleness to execute a singular revolutionary vision. The best arrangement, Mr. Thiel said, is a quasi-mythological structure where you have a king-like founder who can do more than a democratic ruler. Many members of the new right have called for a refounding, a moment when the rules are suspended and rewritten above. So as we talk about participatory governance, it's really important to kind of set the context for that discussion, right? And so part of the context is government failure or lack of government transparency or government incompetence or government ineptitude. And I work a lot with government. I know these folks. I'm not saying this in a mean-spirited way, but just kind of dealing with that perspective on government. And then the other side, this disruptive tech kind of milieu and some of the attitudes and dispositions that drive the mentality in that. And this is, it's a pretty intense and in some ways egregious and offensive view, but it's not a minor view anymore. It's more of a pervasive view. So my work has really been in the opposite or the alternative realm of participatory democratic frameworks and concepts in economy, government, and in social life. And I'm a professor. I've written a book about this stuff called We Decide. I co-founded a nonprofit called the Participatory Budgeting Project, which took a model of participatory democracy from Brazil about 15 years ago, brought it to the United States. It happens in 30 cities. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And I also, as I mentioned before, have been doing a lot of work in the resilience space on climate resilience over the last 10 years, especially since old Superstorm Sandy smacked New York. And New York continues to struggle to not only respond to it, but to be prepared for the next storm. And then also in the last 2 years, I've gotten much more involved in the utility space. I've worked with water utilities for the last 10 years. Hadn't really worked much with the energy utilities, but I am now more in the electric utility space. And we just recently passed a law in New York State to transform my electric utility on Long Island, which is called LIPA. And we're debating the governance structure of this new model. So a lot of space. I have a lot of experience in the governance field, both as a practitioner of setting up a new organization, and as someone who studied different governance models that claim to be participatory. But although I'm an advocate of the participatory democratic, I'm also very conscious of its limits, and I'm also very aware of and concerned about its the fake models of participation. So we will talk about that. Again, these are just some of my locale, where I am institutionally. I'm director of Women's Sustainability Studies, associate director of public engagement, blah, 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 blah. And I mentioned some of this stuff before about co-founding. Again, I've had a foot outside academia the whole time I've been in academia. I think that's very important for several reasons. But I also would say that one of my missions is to really interconnect the expert knowledges, the scientists, whatever, with government, especially folks who work in the agencies, with community. I think that triad for a lot of the governance challenges that we have right now is a really necessary triad from the perspective I'm coming at in terms of economic democracy and resilience. So a question for y'all. I'm a pretty participatory person to my course, so I definitely don't want to lecture this whole time, even though I know we have our interactive portion in the afternoon. But why did you or do you want participation? For what? For whom? What problem are you trying to solve? So if people could put that in the chat, an answer to that, or Sahil, if you want to allow people to speak, I'm fine with that too. So why do you want participation? Why do you want it? What is it for? For whom? Any of these questions? Just so I know a little bit at the beginning here.
Yeah, and if someone wants to speak, just hit your little button that you should see and I can let you up on the stage.
And when I say why, yeah, okay, good. Validating assumptions. Okay, validation or confirmation. Thank you, John. So making sure you're on the same page as your constituents, so to speak. It's not a problem because we want to be engaged in the discourse. Excitement, motivate folks. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, John, again. Keep people going, right? That's a tough one. A lot of times the first event is great, then good. Epistemic reasons, getting knowledge from the crowd. Thank you, monetary supply. Reduce corruption, capture risk. Well, these are ambitious reasons for participation. Classic, but ambitious. Definitely that's going to come up. Anybody else? Why do you want it? Distribute your message, product. Thank you, John. So I took this from the Uniswap governance page, which I think is a really nice, concise list from a lot of y'all's space. There's the classical governance problems, which go back to, the Greeks and the Iroquois and all the people who innovated. I'm looking at Ken now, 100% to John. Intrinsic motivators, meaningful contributions. Yep, good. Some more formal classic problems, voting power asymmetry, talked about the tokens thing earlier. Apathy, which folks have mentioned. Efficient capital allocation, which I think a lot of people in this two-day conference are interested in. I put some more specifics here that we can come back to later. When I was just thinking about a general list, right, one of the most basic, coming from political philosophy, it's to create trust, because it's very hard to do anything else without trust. But the flip side of that is that a lot of participation is designed to manipulate, right? A lot of participation is designed to manipulate. In the recent sort of surveillance capitalism modality, it's to get people to share data so you can make them do things that they don't want to do or know that they're doing, right? So that should just be upfront. And there's a lot of processes that are really manipulation processes. Then back in the sort of non-cynical side, to make people feel part of the organization, to get information that was already noted, to prove a service or operations, make better decisions, monitor accountability. How do you do that? Again, this is something I studied for many years. There's everything from surveys to town halls, talk radio. I know it seems kind of like, right, talk radio seems anachronistic maybe these days, but still very powerful politically and socially in the United States. Focus groups, favorite tool of academics to kind of get, a view. Group chats, message boards. Then there's consensus processes, which I think there's another session about, which is fantastic. Debate, deliberation, and then assemblies, right? So these are different ways of getting engagement and possibly sharing governance. So today we're really going to get into this different kind of models, participatory governance models. We'll talk about governance in terms of research, discussion, deliberation, proposal generation, and decision-making. And I'll look at 3 specific models that I have a lot of experience with, some a little bit more than others. What's called participatory budgeting, deliberative assemblies, participatory action research. And we'll talk about the importance of this. And again, please ask me. I'm a New Yorker. You can interrupt me. You know what I mean? Interrupt me. That's fine. Throw a question, throw an emoji at me, whatever. But again, this is just still outlining some of the stuff we're going to do. Representation of different groups, stakeholders, timelines, that seasonality or cadence question that Toby mentioned, supports for participation, how do you keep people motivated, and then feedback and accountability. So when we look at the contemporary landscape in the United States, it's impoverished. We're primitives, man. We're primitives in the United States. We have very few effective modes of participation, whether in the economic sphere or in the government sphere. We have elections, of course. There's referenda, right? We can actually decide. They're easily manipulated, though. There's town halls. There's public hearings. There's charrettes, where there's gatherings that's a little bit deeper, but a lot of times have no impact. There's juries. That's a lot of times recognized, right? Where you're called for jury duty. A lot of people bemoan it, but that's one of the few areas where you actually have a deliberative setting, and your decision has a big impact. A lot of times, a very big impact, right, on somebody's life. Then there are democratic workplaces, which are something I do a lot of work in, but are sort of minor in the United States. They're more of a feature in other countries. There's a lot of interest, I think, lately. And then there's participatory budgeting, which again, I helped to get going in the United States. And can I just do a check? Is anybody familiar with participatory budgeting? Anybody? It's in about 30 cities in the United States. New York has it at the city council level. But anybody familiar with participatory budgeting? Yes, no, any yeses, any nos? Not yet, no, okay, totally cool. We're gonna go into a little bit more. So I think one of the big themes for me going forward in this talk today is democracy is not about having a voice, it's about sharing power and authority. I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions around participatory democracy as I understand it, that democracy is about having a voice. No participatory Democrat ever said that. The Greeks didn't say that. The Iroquois didn't say that. They didn't say that in indigenous models. They haven't said that in worker cooperative models. It's about sharing power and authority. It's about sharing power and authority. So again, types of participation, right? So talk about 2 different things. A lot of times it's important to separate governance from engagement. Sometimes we do engagement not for governance reasons, but for buy-in, for sharing information, for whatever. Governance is a very specific kind of high bar of participation. There again, some participation is for manipulating or silencing. Some is to inform. Some is to consult, to get a little bit more of a 2-way interaction going. Then there's discussion, where there's more equality in the space. Then there's deciding together, where you're not only participating in discussion, but you're also debating and giving reasons and arguing, and hopefully there's some sort of impact in the decision. And then there's self-rule direct democracy, where the folks actually doing the debating have full power, and the organization is just there to support the process. Again, how do we get it now? Some of the limits of that, discussed that already. This is just some academic definitions of participatory democracy. Kind of give it to that. We can return to that or not. In my book, I focus on 4 dimensions of participatory democracy that sets up participatory governance that I've seen to be very common among successful participatory governance processes across the world. Look at Japan, Brazil, Spain, US. So It's not just about having a voice. It's a redistribution of power, maybe a redistribution of capital. Maybe it's a redistribution of tokens. And there's collective determination. Well, that is, the agenda is open. It can be set by the group. There's capacity development. Some people are going to be more skilled than others. How do you develop trainings to bring everybody up to the same level of capacity to participate? There's should be an explicit consciousness over unequal power relations. Assume that they're there. How do you create associations of shared authority coming out of unequal power relations? That's a tough one. Then fourth, how do you create an expansive sense of solidarity? That is, you construct, cultivate, proliferate, interconnect folks, organizations, movements, and so on. So participatory democracy should lead to solidarity. Very different model than the representative state, which has a constitution, there are rights, there are checks and balances, there are competitive elections, people have a choice. It's sort of our dominant understanding of democracy, which really isn't democracy. It's more like what I would call a representative state. And it's under attack right now, very explicitly. But a participatory democracy has more of a power sharing and some of these features that I said before, and it may even have wealth sharing as well. History, to the great, I write about this in my book, ancient Athens is often held up as the paradigm. It's a bad paradigm. Iroquois is much better. They're also local. Haudenosaunee Federation, indigenous model of governance that was done in the, from about the 12th century to the 1700s here in the Northeast United States. A lot of people think of democracy as involving monitoring. This is what's called monitory democracy or watchdog or civil society democracy. There's a great book. I think I have it right here. It's about 800 pages on the history of democracy. And this is where there's power in the center. And then there's a lot of groups watching or checking the power in the center. I really don't like that model of democracy. I think you should distribute power. And then this is a little bit of a deeper dive on different models in the state realm, in the public-private realm, in the watchdog or monitory realm, and then in a different model, participatory democratic governance, which I call the social public. If people are interested in diving deeper into this, we can, but I think I'm going to keep moving right now. But if you want to look at, this is more broader. I want to get more specific for folks. So it's about 5 to 11. I'm very conscious of time, so I want to finish up in about 15 minutes just to see if there's direct follow-up. I want to go into 3 processes and then one that connects them all. So the first is participatory budgeting. This was a governance innovation that came out of Brazil as they transitioned out of the dictatorship that they were under for a couple decades in the late 1980s. And this is where a pot of money that was part of the government from taxes or, issuing of currency, and it was transferred over to a community that was impacted by the budget. But the rules for how to allocate it was determined by the community in conversation with the government. So folks got to design the process, and then they brainstorm ideas about how to spend the money. They develop those ideas into proposals, and then they vote. And the winning projects are funded by that pot of money. In Brazil, for many years, they did healthcare, housing, transportation, education. It was very expansive, like 30% of the city budget. In New York City, right, that would be $30 billion. In New York City, it's been a tiny amount of money. It's been 30 million, 40 million, 50 million. There's been improvements to parks, improvements to schools, safer streets initiatives that have been funding out of participatory budgeting in New York City. It's spread across the world. It's in 7,000 cities right now. You see it used for a lot of different kinds of sectors. One in particular that's gaining a lot of momentum is around climate change, right? How can we allow or enable communities to make their own proposals about how to deal with heat, with flooding, with energy insecurity, and these kinds of things. So this is what's called participatory budgeting, and it's one of the most successful participatory governance processes in the world. Again, it's been going for about 30 years. In the United States, nonprofit Participatory Budgeting Project, which I co-founded, brought it to the United States about 13 years ago, started in Chicago, went to New York. Now it's in a couple dozen cities. This is a ballot. So one of the fun things about PB is that you don't, get together to choose an elected official or choose a person to go do this. You choose projects. So this is a ballot from one of the early years, and you can see It's kind of small print there, but and then in New Yorkers, I believe this is from the Bronx, Northern Manhattan district, you could choose 5 proposals. So that's nice. It's not winner take all. You can actually choose multiple projects, and multiple projects usually win because the pot of money is big enough to fund these. So planting sidewalk trees, electrical upgrades at a library, public housing playground repair, computer upgrades, and so on. These are some of the proposals there that are on this ballot. So it's a participatory ballot. Well, any questions about that? Let me just pause right there before I go back to, I'm going to go to a different model in a second. Any questions on the participatory budgeting? All right, I'm going to go to the next model. Deliberative assemblies and juries. So this is another very successful participatory governance process. Here, a topic is chosen and design stewardship teams formed. One real successful one of these was in Ireland, and they did abortion. And this was several years ago. Ireland had banned abortion for its entirety, and there were a lot of folks who were not happy with that, and the politicians were scared to make a decision about it. So they did a referendum where folks from around the country were randomly selected. They were put in a process where they were educated about the different dimensions of the issue, and they hear from multiple experts and different stakeholders about the different views on this. And then they deliberate. They deliberate like a jury for several weeks. And they end up overturning the ban on abortions in Ireland, but creating frameworks around it and limits around it that were acceptable or amenable to different constituencies within the country. One of the most successful deliberative assembly processes and high impact in the world. Another model is around research. This is what's called participatory action research, where, again, in the beginning, there's an issue that's identified, a constituency that is brought in, and a research team of professors or researchers or local community leaders. They bring in, they set up a team where a lot of times it's high school students or community members who are trained to do the research and then go out into their community to ask and survey folks about their views of it. So I've been part of one that was around what are called the social determinants of health. And sorry, was there a question or anything? No. And so high school students were trained to go out into the community and ask people about what are the things that most impact your health. One surprising thing was people were talking about housing, right? Housing insecurity. So it wasn't just about the hospital or your doctor or your insurance. It was about how secure is your housing? How are the police treating you? So the community really defined this agenda, and then that agenda was put together in a report with all the findings, and it's been influencing the hospital system as it's reforming the public health programs in that neighborhood. This is in central Brooklyn. So that's what's called participatory action research. So when you look at these three, right, we talked about deliberative assemblies, participatory action research, and PB. What are their strengths? How are they different? So shared curriculum. One big thing in participatory governance is everybody on the same page? Does everybody know what they need to know to decide together about what to do? So that's been a problem in participatory budgeting because there's really no shared curriculum about what communities need or what communities have done and what communities have favored. People are just putting in proposals and making their own proposals, irrespective maybe of a deep knowledge of what communities have done or need. So PB lacks that. Participatory action research has that, and deliberative assemblies have that because all the folks in that jury, right, they're all reading and all listening to the same group of experts of diverse views, so they're on the same page. Is there a mini public cultivated? That is there a core group that gets a deeper training? That does happen in PB with what are called the delegates who put together the ballots, and that happens in participatory action research and the deliberative assemblies. But do you do broader outreach to the public? That doesn't happen with a participatory action research. That doesn't happen with deliberative assemblies. It does happen with participatory budgeting because the public gets to vote about which projects to support. So again, every participatory governance process has its strengths and weaknesses, has its boundaries, has its powers, and that should be very, recognized up front. No process is going to solve all your problems. What can be, and then there's also worker cooperatives. I think I'm going to skip this, but if people want to talk more about that, I know we're not specifically on worker co-ops, but worker co-ops are more or less relevant for discussions around participatory governance because this is a view on the tradition about how businesses internally function. But I think the organizers of this conference weren't necessarily as into this being relevant, but could go into it. Now, what would it mean? Is there an example of connecting or combining these participatory governance processes in one institutional setting? And one thing that we're trying to do in Long Island is actually we passed a bill in the New York State legislature to democratize our public utility. And this would actually redesign the governance process. And what it would do is it would have an elected board made up of different stakeholders from around Long Island and the Rockaways, which is where our utility operates. And that board would represent different geographies, demographics, expertise. It's a tough call because you really want to have representation in all these. You need some people who know something about finance, other people who know about compliance, right? But then you also want demographic and geographic representation. How do you balance that? That's a very tough challenge for boards. But that's something that we're trying to take on. You also want the board to be able to comply with all the other regulations at different levels, which is considerable in the electric utility space. So they got to be knowledgeable of that. And you want the board to be able to do engagement and monitoring to build a culture that's participatory. But we don't think that a board itself can do all that. So we don't want to overload the board with responsibilities. So we also want to create an independent institute, which will be outside the purview of the board, but would monitor the utility and the board and design its own process. So that would be where more of the participatory democratic that I've just discussed would be located. It wouldn't be located in the utility. It'd be located outside the utility. And that's where you would do your participatory action research. That's where you would do your participatory budgeting. And that's where you would do your delegate assembly. And those processes would inform recommendations that go from this observatory or institute to influence the board. So that's an example of where in one institutional setting, you combine a number of different participatory governance processes. This is an institutional setting which everybody's connected to because everybody has electricity. And it's an institutional setting with a considerable financial power. Our utilities operating budget is over $3 billion a year, over $3 billion. So that's pretty big, right? So that's very exciting to be able to do participatory governance at that level. So that's just one of the projects I'm working at. Another one I'm working on is with a much smaller energy democracy group. That's a business that's run as a worker cooperative and a consumer cooperative as well, actually, where community owns the energy. And I actually see a lot of this Web3 stuff as being very relevant to the energy space and the electricity space with solar, with battery storage, and with what's called demand response, where people are turning off their appliances in order to save money and this kind of thing. So that's something that I'm very interested in with Web3 and participatory governance is electricity and energy. But I'm not going to go into details on that now, but just to kind of mention that. So I'm just going to stop here for a second. I have a couple more slides that just specifically connects a lot of this to the Uniswap governance questions and some of the other internet conversations, and we can go into that. We've got 20 some minutes, but I really would rather just pause and give people a chance to respond or ask questions or tell me I'm wrong about something.
Am I jumping in? Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Who's that?
Hey, this is Ken.
Ken, I think.
Hi, Ken. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is working or not. Hey, that was awesome. Thank you. So I'm New York City, born and raised too. I've watched a lot of yes, go New York. Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of work, I guess, or at least I've tried to do a lot of work with the Board of Education. I've worked with some charter schools and really tried to see some of the funding be used more appropriately. But I think, one of the things that I struggle to see is sort of like with a lot of the conversations that I've been a part of, or I guess like I've not been a part of that many, but especially with the Board of Education, a lot of the conversations that are had don't take into consideration like intersectionality. A lot of it is really sort of looking at numbers and sort of optimizing in this sort of like MBA type way. where, you know, the person who is really driving the budgets forward don't really look at, you know, why are schools in the Bronx, disproportionately affected by like large classrooms, whereas, you know,
Right.
the antagonistic take is always like, oh, well, look at like the Upper West Side, you have just as large, or downtown Manhattan, you have just
Right.
as large of classrooms with the same amount of student to teacher ratio. But clearly, it's not about money. It's not about whatever. It's not about the conditions and environment of the school, but it's about sort of the external environments which you can't control. So
Right.
us providing more funding here, us providing more resources to a certain area just does not help.
Right.
And so I don't know. It's been frustrating for me to see a lot of the intersectionality be left out of the conversation. And I think, you know, bringing it back to today and Uniswap, you know, a lot of people tend to forget that when we think about engagement, we think about sort of why funding or why resources need to be spent in certain directions. The conversation goes back to like, oh, okay, well, look at the numbers. Like these numbers don't look good.
Right.
Well, these are not, it's not, you know, these are not the quantitative measures you're looking for when you're thinking about impact. And so I guess I'm curious to hear your take on sort of how this has been reconciled, or like how different attempts have been used to, I guess, like reconcile intersectionality and consider, you know, greater holistic views and takes on different decisions.
Yes, great question. Old problem. So I would point, you know, I had that list of 4 principles of participatory democracy. And the second and third one, the second one is capability development. And the third one is replacing relations of inequality or unequal power with shared authority. And so what that means is that when you go into a situation and you want to put in a participatory governance processes, you really have to track, sure. I'm gonna get a request to put this slide back up. Let me just, I think this will work. And governance. All right. And so let's see. Here we go. So we're on 2 and 3. So here, it's not about the amount of money that somebody gets. It's about the amount of resources that they need to develop the capacity. So in some districts, it might be 30 students in a class. I got 2 kids, so one's out of high school now, one's in high school. In some districts, 25 to 30 students might be okay. You see the capacity level of that class, it's fine. In other districts, 25 to 30 students might not be working. They might have serious linguistic diversity in the classroom. There might be other external factors because of previous levels of education or because of something climate in the neighborhood where that's not a good dynamic for them. So that money that's coming in, where folks might think, oh, it should just go into the same things that, that's going into all the other districts. Let's offer 2 more classes. It might need to go to class size reduction in some districts. That's the point of having a local participatory process. Doesn't mean that the local participatory process addresses every issue or has all power, but it needs to be in there to be able to have an understanding about what the specific needs of that place. And so for me, participatory governance always needs to track 2 and 3. It's always got to track. You go in, you assume there's inequalities there. How are you going to deal with these inequalities? Second is, don't focus on numbers, as Ken's saying. Focus on capacities. What are people able to do? Where do you want to get them? What kinds of resources do they need to be able to get to that level? Ken, that helps?
Okay, so I'm just taking notes. Awesome.
If there's more, yeah, go ahead, Sahil.
Just saw John's comment as well, asking for the slides up so we can share the 4 principles as well in the session tonight. And I can also send you the slide too.
Yeah, great. Other questions, follow-up, or different issues? John?
Hey, yeah, just unmuted myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I guess kind of
Yep.
a selfish question maybe that's based on kind of the stuff I'm working on, but I'm curious how you think about participatory decision making or budgeting within organizations where the primary goals are biased pretty much towards like expert driven capacities or something. Like imagine you're doing like biomedical research or something, and like the clear purpose of the org is going to be something where like biology PhDs are really going to be like driving forward the research itself. Like, but maybe you've gathered a group of people around them who are interested or involved. Like, how do you think about the role of like participatory decision making or budgeting in a world where maybe there is like a minority and an inequality in like the exact kind of like capabilities or capacities that you're mentioning? Like,
Right.
But it kind of comes back to your very first question, like, why do you want engagement? Like, why do you want this in the first place? Have you seen examples of that, or how to think about that in orgs where it's maybe non-obvious, but actually turned out to be really helpful to have a larger engaged group than just maybe like a small research team or something like that?
Yes. So I think that this is often an issue, right? So anytime, you're trying to get participation relative to some outcome. So you have a pot of money, you have a goal, you have a need, you're trying to produce a product to fulfill the goal and address the need. What is the range of decision space for the process? So you're bringing people in. Should they have, be able to decide 7 different things, 2 different things? Who sets the constraints? You're always going to have a constraint. You're always going to have boundaries for the process. Experts, a lot of times, are going to have to set boundaries for the process. We've seen this in New York City with participatory budgeting, and you see this all over the place. So, some places may, want resilient. Maybe they want to build a seawall, right? And on the Hudson River, off the Lower East Side. They actually don't, but they're getting one anyway. So, the average community member, including me, isn't going to understand wave dynamics and what's going to happen with the sediment and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's going to be expert knowledges that are going to have to be tapped to tell people, okay, well, if you do this, this happens. If you do this, this happens, right? So it's not like you're saying to the community, hey, do you want a seawall? Or where do you want it? No. That's insulting for everybody, right? We don't know where the seawall should go. But we want to protect biodiversity. We want public access. We only want it to cost this amount. So get the experts over there. They should be working for us, and they tell us what the decision points are or what the trade-offs are. And then we have our input where our input makes sense in the process and where it's needed. So this can happen in the biomedical space, right? It can happen over issues of like, what are people's privacy concerns, or what are side effects, or what about side consequences of this kind of research, right? People don't know that, but people might have concerns about X, Y, or Z. And so then they come in and they have a decision point around that, but they're not the ones making the full judgment about the efficacy or the causality of certain processes or medications, right? So there's, I think that's one response. On the deliberative assemblies, it's interesting because then it's a jury. You're sequestering people, and they might be there for a month. And this happened in Oregon. Used to do this in the healthcare space, and they would learn a lot of healthcare shit, right? And they'd be doing the deep dive, and they'd learn about this and the funding, and there's all these experts that are presenting, and they can call people back. Well, what about this? We don't understand. But when you have people going into that process, you have to screen them and make sure that they're willing and able to learn all that stuff you want them to learn. You can't just randomly select people and say, go at it, right? So there's a lot of pre-screening of your group that has to happen. So that's a different model. That's different from PB, where you are going to give people a full kind of power, but you're also going to have a shared curriculum for them, and you're confident that they can process and digest the shared curriculum. So that's a different model.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
Welcome. Other folks, Monet Supply.
Charles. Go for it, Charles.
Hey, can you hear me?
Charles, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a question of curiosity for you. And as most of my experience with governance is within Web3 and decentralized governance, I kind of just wanted to get your take on some things. So, I mean, in Web3, governance. It hasn't been around all as much as traditional governance models, but the industry tends to discredit like the evolution of governance and coordination and the failures and like the lessons we've learned, and tries to really just plug technical solutions on top of things, when in reality it comes back to humans and decision making around that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, I think Web3 definitely needs to kind of cater more around those human like systems and decision making, but in the more in real life governance systems, do you think that they could like pull in more technical solutions to kind of sheer away from more it all just being like human?
The only sector that I'm really aware of some of this, how it plays out, is in the electricity and energy space. Can people hear me okay? There's a little.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So I think there's a lot of the tech digital governance architecture, right? So for example, if I have solar on my house and I have a battery, depending on the household, I might want those things to do different things. So one household might want it to charge my car in a way, because I have an electric vehicle, and I want to pay as little possible to do that. Another might not have an EV, and they actually want to make a little bit of money, right, by selling power back to the grid. So neither household has an understanding about how the architecture works. And they don't have that technical knowledge, but they do have a preference about what they want it to do, right? They have a preference about what they want it to do. So I think that's the kind of example where there might be a whole technical dimension that just folks isn't accessible to folks, but they have preferences about how that architecture should be deployed in different circumstances, depending upon the needs and values of the users. Does that kind of help?
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, like Estonia, like incorporating some sort of like digital voting in their systems, like I was kind of thinking more from like the broader standpoint, but the resource allocation aspect makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Well, yeah, on the governance aspect, the most developed national model is in Taiwan. I don't know if we're going to have a Taiwan debate today. Probably not. But and so it's called V-Taiwan, which is Taiwan's one of the most wired countries. It's got the best digital infrastructure probably of any country, and it's 25 million people. So it's like a huge metropolitan area kind of thing. And there, because you know that people have capacity to really participate in the digital space, you can put a lot of stuff in the digital space. And it's very multimodal, and everybody watches the same debate, and then people can plug in their questions to a moderator, and the moderator is making sure that there's diversity in what the questions are asked. And then they're in a different phase where the experts testify and the public can ask the experts in front of the elected officials what to do. That's very powerful, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're usually me versus my elected official. I don't know a lot of stuff, but I can say, hey, expert, Cindy over here, tell my elected official what the deal is on this, right? So there's very simple things that you can do about who's in the room and who has the power within a room to say something, right? To share that authority. And so I would encourage folks looking at the national level. I haven't looked at the Estonia stuff recently. There's a lot of stuff happening in voting. And then there's, which is one dimension, but like Portugal and Singapore's done a little bit of this in a different, more authoritarian way. But there's a few other national models out there for getting input and having decisions made, either in the regulatory space or the resource allocation space. The regulatory space, a lot of the favored mechanism for participatory folks is the referendum, right? You put it on the ballot. Do you want, the water utility to be regulated by the state government or not? So whatever. But the problem is, because the way that local media is controlled by oligopoly capitalism, and it's so accessible because your vote, right, or your voice is dollars or voice, right? You can translate money into voice. That referendum processes, you look at California, you look at Oregon, not as much in New York, they're disasters because there's so much misinformation that comes out in a referendum because there's no debate. It's just the media. So if you wanted to have a referendum, shared curriculum, you'd have to figure out who's the institution that's going to hold the knowledge that is inclusive for folks to be able to consult to make the decision. And that's the referendum model. But the referendum model has really been really suffered a lot of downside because of lack of control over media and information.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting. I wasn't aware of the Taiwan. I mean, I think it solves a lot of problems with, I mean, as a voter here, I'm in Toronto in Canada, like going to like a ballot box, like there's very few things to actually understand what's going on. You don't hear the leaders talking unless you go and attend or you seek that out, which is kind of like that whole like voter apathy causing stuff. So if you can reduce that by having like a live stream where people talk, Q&A, I think that's really cool.
Right. And I think the other thing is to have it multi-phase, right? So some can be more focused on the legislative, some can be more focused on, views on other things. I will say really quickly on this, one thing that was fascinating in the city, so when New York City, when COVID hit, there were elections happening that summer and into the next fall, city council. And they all went Zoom. They all went on, the debates were on Zoom. So what happened was nobody was used to Zoom, right? They would have these debates with the four candidates. There were no time limits. So that some of the debates went on 4, 5, 6 hours. And people hadn't developed bullshit bullet points for 6 hours, right? They had bullshit bullet points for 10 minutes. And so there was a level of debate that was unprecedented, right? Because people were unfamiliar and they're like, oh my goodness, right? And so they say, oh, what are you going to do on housing? And say, oh, well, we want to have more affordable. How are you going to do that? Oh, that's not going to work. We already tried that. Oh, really? Well, and so, there were some examples in the digital space where it was easier for people to participate for long periods of time. And people aren't going to sit in their YMCA gym for 6 hours, right? On a Tuesday night. But anyway, so we got work to do, but then you have to have trust and buy-in by the electeds as well as the hosts of the debate. And that's where we need a lot of work, more or less, depending on where you are, because of distrust levels.
Yeah.
I think we got about 5 minutes. Again, we'll do the deep dive